Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune. It's not always funny. For the third week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Since 1990, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed comment on the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about American politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is a shutdown edition of News from Neptune. I don't take, and the shutdown refers not to the federal government itself, but to the military. I don't take Vox News very seriously. They tend to run stories like the following taken from yesterday's Vox website. 1. Donald Trump's terrifying plan to win the 2018 midterms. The story is that he's hoping for a terrorist attack like 9/11. I'm not making this up. Go read Vox News. It concludes, quote, if Trump thinks a terrorist attack would serve his political interests, either through a blind rally-round-the-flag effect or by specifically validating anti-immigrant demagoguery, or what have you, how hard is he really working to keep the country safe? Close quote. That's a new height, it seems to me, of Russiagate nonsense. The second story from a box yesterday, foreign spies could be manipulating Trump through Fox News, close quote. It's an interview with an ex-CIA man who is on the faculty of American University, School of International Studies, I think now. The article says, and I quote, wouldn't it be great if you were a hostile intelligence service and you could influence a person like Sean Hannity? I do not believe that Sean Hannity is a Russian asset, but that's not the point. If you're a spy, maybe you try to work his producers or the person who does his makeup. You look for any way inside that world. This is not a comedy bit. This is Vox News. Fox actually says, and in spite of that, and it shows the state of mainstream media, the best account in mainstream media yesterday of the military and the government shutdown. The article is entitled Government Shutdown and Trump Military Impact. And it says, and I quote, President Donald Trump keeps claiming that the possible government shutdown on Friday will hurt the military worst of all. On Thursday, he tweeted, a government shutdown will be devastating to our military, something the Dems care very little about. Close quote. He made similar comments to reporters during a visit to the Pentagon a few hours later. But that's not entirely true, says Fox News. That's because a government shutdown doesn't actually mean the entire government shuts down. Government employees who are considered accepted are exempt from the furlough and will continue to work and get paid like normal. Active duty military personnel are among those who are accepted, so the military will still function even if the government shuts down. Where the shutdown could potentially impact the military, though, is if the thousands of civilian officials and contractors who work for the Department of Defense in support of the military are furloughed. Positions like accountants, secretaries, and press officers, all of whom do critical work that makes the military run smoothly, are nevertheless considered non-accepted and could therefore be sent home if the government shut down, though some people are forced to work for free and just receive back pay after the government reopens. If the shutdown lasts only a day or two, military personnel probably won't notice any major changes to their day-to-day work, says Brian Callen, a defense budget expert at Capital Alpha Partners. But if the shutdown lasts longer, stretching into weeks, that's a different story. The military still worked during the last government shutdown, and they expect it to in the one that is possible, at least today. That's Vox News pointing out that the shutdown is, in a sense, doesn't matter for the things that our government mainly does, which is kill people. And it's hardly to be surprised. We should not be surprised at the folderol around it, because it has to do with the convincing the American public that the ongoing policies on war and the economy, the policies followed by the last administration and the current one, in spite of all the backing and filling, are correct and must be followed. There's much more to say about this, and we will have a word or two about it in the rest of News from Neptune, starting with David Green.
Okay. Let me just piggyback onto that and say that similar to the tax bill, which I was wrong to think that it wouldn't go down. It did go down, but I was right to predict that the graduate students wouldn't lose their waivers in the process of that going down, because there were powerful interests involved in that, and those waivers, those non-taxable waivers, did survive the tax bill. Similar to that, I think that whatever happens with this settlement, it isn't in the interest not just of the dreamers themselves, but lots of relatively powerful people, not to punish the dreamers or not to make the dreamers the victim of this whatever's going to go down regarding the budget and the wall and the children's health program, all that other stuff. I think the dreamers, obviously, they should be supported. The children who came to this country as non-citizens with their parents, as obviously as young children. So we'll see if I'm right about that. I don't see, however vicious some of the things going on are. There are some very vicious things that ICE, the immigration and customs and customs enforcement is doing now to a couple of notable immigrant rights activists. I don't think that we're going to be seeing the dreamers deported en masse. Anyway, let me just also make a note following up on your concerns about this Russophobia. I took the trouble last week or earlier this week to look at the report that was issued by the Cardin Group, by the Democrats on the foreign relations, the Senate Democrats on the foreign relations, just to see what it was, just to see what this 200-page report was that allegedly proves that all of the evil in the world traces back to Vladimir Putin. And basically just a sort of, maybe not a classic conspiratorial document, but it's certainly recognizable. The style of it in its academic, somewhat academic, or at least journalistic trappings, is hard to believe that such a document could be put out, and it's hard to take seriously. I know we've been talking about Senator Cardin in relation to the progressive Democrats and whether or not we should take them seriously and support them in terms of their anti-war views. Well, if Senator Cardin is saying that space aliens had landed on January 20th, 2017 and have been in power ever since, why would anyone take him seriously? But if you read this document about Russia, if you just read a few pages of it, I think I read 30 or 40 pages, or skim through 30 or 40 pages, skim through part of the rest of the document, which just begins with saying, Russia is subverting everything in the whole world, and this is the proof we have for it. And it's footnotes. It's well footnoted with articles from the New York Times, the Washington Post, various think tanks, various authorities, various analysts of various kinds. But none of it proves anything. All it does is assert that because of this basic assumption that Russia is controlling everything, that everything that they say that has been said or done in relation to, Ukraine or anything else is further evidence of this. It's this classic McCarthyite conspiratorial theorizing. If theory is too highfalutin a word to use, it ought to embarrass the Democratic Party to be I mean, the Republicans wouldn't even sign on to this. Obviously, not for the best motives, but still, it's like why would any Democrat who wanted to be taken seriously think that this should be taken seriously?
Yeah, I think the Republicans, we're talking about the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that Senator Cardin is the ranking member of. The ranking member, in this sense, is the Democrat second in command to the committee, which is chaired by a Republican, of course. And the Republicans, very interestingly, didn't object to, and therefore quash, or sign off on this Russiagate, this conspiratorial report that Cardin released with a great deal of ballyhoo a week or so ago. And I think it can be said in a sense that the Republicans are happy to have the Democrats take the lead on that. They believe it just as much or as little as the Democrats do, but of course it's about the Russian conspiracy that put a Republican president in office. Now, the Republicans can't attack that directly, but they're perfectly happy to use the Russiagate nonsense, or to let it pass, in other words, to make sure that this administration, even if it's nominally Republican, adheres to the same foreign policy and war policies that the Obama administration did. So the Republicans, in that sense, who could have stopped the report, could have stopped the release of the report simply by saying the committee doesn't approve the release of this report, didn't do that and let the Democrats do it and take the blame or the praise, if that's what it is, because in a sense they agree with it. They are concerned about Trump and his administration departing from the pro-war, pro-Wall Street policies of the last administration. They're nervous about them and want to avoid any suggestion that, hey, they're colluding with the Russians.
Yeah, and not to beat it into the ground, but it's like, it's hard to wrap your head around what it is they're doing in this report. They're asserting a bunch of stuff, and then they're referring to a New York Times or Washington Post article that supposedly proves what they're asserting. Right. And when you try to wrap your head around it and say, well, what's the theory here? What's the argument? And what's the evidence for this argument? The evidence is always stuff that was said in the New York Times.
Right.
It doesn't ever get down to actually building a case from the bottom up. Evidence that shows that this happened and this resulted of that happened, and they never really get around to saying how it. I don't think they get around to saying how it is that actually Russia might have influenced Trump's victory. I mean, a lot of people are saying that in a lot of different contexts, but it's not. This is this global conspiracy thing. It's like all these. It's like the entire world. Russia has got agents and has got schemes for doing all these bad things in all these other countries. And in the obvious cases where we know who's doing these things, like Ukraine or Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, or Czech, the Czech Republic. I mean, all these places which just shows this not just conspiracy, but this vast conspiracy, this overwhelming conspiracy, just drains any specificity out of what it is the Russians are doing, where it's just like, well, Putin wants to be God, and he's acting like God, and he's doing stuff that God would do if God wanted to. It's just nuts. It's just nuts. But anyway,
This is absolutely important, and it has to be put into the context of the American foreign policy, which is the background of the whole problem. The American political establishment is worried that Trump administration might depart from the U.S. foreign policy as practiced by the last administration. The problem with understanding this is that the last administration was very clever at masking what its foreign policy actually was. Most Americans don't know that the Obama administration exaggerated the war provocations against Russia and against China, exaggerated them even beyond the previous administrations, and continued those war provocations. At the same time, it was at war in 8 countries around the world, and was the first American administration since George Washington to be at war for 2 presidential terms. Now, that war-making of the Obama administration was masterfully masked. It was masked from the one enemy that the American government really fears, that is the American public. Obama's talents as a president was to do that masking, as he understood from very early on. You can read his book his audition.
Audacity of Hope, or the other one, Dreams of My Father.
I always have trouble with the title because the actual title of the book, not the one about his father, the other one is called
Audacity of Hope, The
Audacity of Hope. Yeah. And I can never say that without saying mendacity, that is lying, the mendacity of hope, because that's what he was good at. That book is worth reading, particularly after all these years, because it talks at some length about how he is going to deal with the anti-war movement coming out of Vietnam. And I mean, that was the milieu in which he was formed intellectually and politically, and he knew how to co-opt it, which is what made him president. So this has a history, and unless you understand, it seems to me, what the U.S. is doing in its aggression against Russia and China, it's impossible to understand what the U.S. political establishment is worried about when it thinks that Trump will depart from that, and that Russiagate is primarily an insurance policy, as one of their operatives said just recently, an insurance policy to make sure that Trump stays with the program, of belligerence towards Russia and belligerence towards China. And Trump keeps indicating that maybe he won't. Happened again this week in regard to the Syrian question. So it's rather hard to take this as at all straightforward, but it is important when we see things like a ranking Democratic senator releasing the sort of the report that David has just described, and making the Russiagate claims, which are nonsense on their face, but they have a purpose. It's madness, but there be method in it. And that's the method that we have to understand.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, it isn't like Ben Cardin is partly crazy, and then he's got his sane progressive part, and then his partly
he supports the Israeli lobby with
more
enthusiasm than most.
Yes, right, exactly. So that should call into question, even though politics is politics and compromises are made. I'm not saying, I mean, there was you had a kind of tete-a-tete the last few days regarding what it is we can support, or whether anti-war people should support the PDA, and
you mean our local discussion?
Yeah,
yes.
Local discussion. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but I'll leave that aside for now.
One last comment about Cardin. He introduced or co-sponsored the bill to make the anti-BDS bill that makes supporting a boycott against Israel's illegal occupation a felony. Now, I mean, can you believe this? This is incredible on the face of it, and that anyone who, says, okay, but he does good things elsewhere after something like that.
Yeah,
It's got to be mad.
It gets back to the as my father used to always say, how aside, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play aside from that?
That's right. Exactly.
That kind of argument.
And
maybe not a good analogy, but still.
One more note about Cardin. He has a Democratic primary opponent. He has an opponent in the Democratic primary coming up in Maryland. Very interesting. Chelsea Manning has announced her candidacy for the seat that Cardin holds. That's going to be fun. That's going to be worthwhile.
Maybe. Maryland is a blue state in the worst sense of the word.
But
it's a rich blue professional class state, and dominated by the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And these are not people that are questioning, these are not people that are off the Democratic Party line to a great extent. That's my guess.
Yeah.
Maybe, okay, you're from there. Maybe you know more about it.
You may be quite right.
Yeah.
As I say, I grew up there, but that was in the Lincoln administration.
Yeah.
So it was a possibility that there would be surprises for Cardin in a primary challenge from Chelsea Manning. At least will be interesting to see if the issues are talked about at all, rather than suppressed as they would be under the political circumstances you described. I think Manning's nobody's dummy, and the possibility of this becoming interesting. There are even talks of a fundraiser for Manning around town. So,
I will always admit I'm wrong if I'm wrong. Okay.
I don't think I don't think we can understand quite what's going on.
And I'll be happy to admit that I'm wrong if all these people from Silver Springs who drive into Washington D.C. to work their $150,000 jobs, start supporting Chelsea Manning. I'll be quite.
You're being snippy now, David. You're listening to news from Neptune, and we're casting animadversions on the
lawyers,
voters of
accountants, government bureaucrats of various kinds. The people who run our lives. Anyway, I've got about 4 things maybe just to refer to in the weekly News Gazette critique column. They have to really pound on something to annoy me with it, because I'm used to the way they are, but they've been doing this population thing for quite a long time, fretting about how many thousand people out of our 13 million state, how many people have left the state in the last year. It's not clear whether people are leaving or people are not being born or more people are dying. It's not clear where all this data comes from. But just to say that when the News Gazette starts to harp on this as a proof that there's something wrong with our state, it needs to be said, or I think it needs to be said, and I'll say it, that this state isn't that different from any other state in this neoliberal country. Yes. We're affected by larger contextual policies that are national and federal in nature, that have been going on for 40 years. And what's a little bit peculiar about this state is that we have this lousy taxation system combining a high sales tax with a constitutionally mandated flat tax, which doesn't permit our government, our state government, to procure the revenues that it needs for the for the kind of services that states outside of the South have got used to going back to the post-World War II era. So we're a rich state, we're a blue state, people want services, but the tax system doesn't pay for them. Again, both political parties have been a part of the problem as to how this tax system can't be fixed, because both political parties are either implicitly or explicitly support governmental austerity. And so this is the situation. If there's anything to be understood about the relative differences in population loss compared to our neighboring states or other states, there's a lot of factors. They don't know what causes this. They don't know what's behind it. But it doesn't really matter if it's symptomatic of something. If it indeed is symptomatic of something, it's symptomatic of everything that's ailing this country and can be fixed, both at the state level, but mostly at the federal level in terms of the kind of basic, if you want to move away from more radical critiques, just the basic Keynesian policies that would infuse more money into the economy and put people to work who pay taxes and who would mitigate the increases of economic inequality that we've seen in the last 40 years. Same old thing I say every week, just in a kind of different context. The News Gazette editors keep using the word supercharged, that the corporate tax breaks and the corporate this and the corporate that are going to supercharge the economy. Yeah. And the question is, the economy has been supercharged for quite a while. The economy grows. It's just that half the people don't benefit from that growth. All the growth goes to the upper 10% or upper 1%. And so so supercharging isn't the problem, and it isn't that we expect any differently from the editors of our local newspaper to help people to understand this. So
whenever you hear the phrase "the economy" from mainstream media, as in phrases "the economy is doing well" or "the economy might not do well," translate the economy into quote profits of rich people. The economy is doing well equals the profits of rich people are doing well. The economy is doing poorly equals the profits of rich people are doing poorly. That's they're not talking about you and me.
Yeah, and whether they're even when they're talking about especially the stock market, but even property values and things like that. Well, most people, property values, they don't participate in wealth accumulation by property values, except at a very modest level. So this is a trap we've gotten ourselves into, and the propaganda and the rhetoric around this is hard to kind of break through. And not just at the News Gazette, but in the national, in the liberal media, the New York Times, Washington Post, public broadcasting system, however you want to talk about it. There's very strict limits on how deeply you can go into why this dysfunctional system is so dysfunctional and who is served by its being dysfunctional.
Exactly. As usual on these matters, the Democrat propaganda is marginally more duplicitous than the Republican propaganda. Take, for example, the budget crisis in Illinois that we were hearing about. Whatever the Governor Rauner and the Republicans in the legislature said about the budget crisis, they were accurate in saying that they wanted to cut back on services. They wanted to produce a budget that spent less money and so forth. And the Democrats said that no, the problem was that the Democrats couldn't accept the budget that the state administration wanted because it would mean raising taxes on rich people. They didn't say that, but that was their position. So in some sense, the Republicans were more honest than the Democrats. The Democrats caused the budget crisis as much as the Republicans did by being unwilling to raise taxes on the rich. And David just pointed out some of the difficulties of raising taxes on the rich in Illinois. But there was a way, and the way was to establish a financial transaction tax, a tax on the sort of a sales tax on financial matters, a sales tax on bonds and stock that would affect perhaps 1% of the population of Illinois, but that 1% works on LaSalle Street, the Wall Street of the state of Illinois, and it would affect rich people who make money from the financial center that Chicago is. The Democrats were unwilling to do it because that's the people they're working for. and therefore the budget crisis went on, and the Democrats lyingly kept blaming the Republicans for it.
So anyway, well, I could go on and on about this, but let me go on to my next point here, which is related, I think, very much related.
Wonderful line from Gerald Ford. I could go on and on, but you know the truth.
Or my favorite is George H.W. Bush, who said, "I'm never gonna criticize the United States. I don't care what the facts are.
I don't care what the facts
Or
are.
I'm never gonna apologize."
Right.
Is what he said. There's a podcast done by Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton in which they begin every program with that tape, with that sound clip.
Some things don't change in American politics.
It's called Moderate Rebels. Their podcast is called Moderate Rebels. But anyway,
we'll put a link to that on the Facebook page too.
On to Amazon.com or onto Amazon. Just the New York Times yesterday had an article, kind of more of an advertising article than a real news article about the 20 cities that are the finalists in the Amazon sweepstakes. And I wasn't so interested to find out which cities that was, but you would expect, usual sort of Midwestern cities, and some in the South, some on the East Coast. But anyway, Austin, Texas, that kind of thing. It was interesting to read the comments. There were many comments, and people aren't really buying into the idea that it's such a good idea that Amazon 2.0 or Amazon East or Midwest is such a good idea for their city or for any city. And people from Seattle, which is of course Amazon's home base, were chiming in and saying, Seattle used to be a nice place to live
until Amazon.
And and it's of course a dilemma. It's not maybe it's not as clear cut as all that. There's growth, there's jobs, but the nature of the manner in which Amazon works and the way it deals with these urban governments. One of the commenters said something like, "This reminds me of when the king would." In fairy tales or in I don't know whatever history or probably not real history, that the king would request that the subjects produce virgins, present virgin. I know this is probably not a politically correct thing to say in the post-Harvey Weinstein era, but it's like the kings would present virgins for the king to select one, and it's like these cities are putting up their programs and how much they're going to pay Amazon.com to move to in a sense ruin their lifestyle, to raise property values, to raise rents, to congest traffic, to do all these things. And it was really pretty overwhelming in the comments section. And obviously it's not a scientific sample, because the people who are appalled by this are going to be more likely to comment than people who just haven't really thought about it or just assume that, what could be wrong with jobs? There's a lot of unrest. The natives are restless out there with the bill of goods that's been sold to them, and it's coming to a head in the person of Jeff Bezos and Amazon, and how people perceive him influencing their lives, while meanwhile, of course, they go on Amazon. We, us, we're all dependent on that in a certain way.
I was having a fantasy on this while hearing about this issue of King Arthur and the Round Table trying to decide where they were going to build their capital. Where was Camelot going to be placed in the British Isles? Now, problems here, yes, of course. But still in all, the notion about how that would have gone down in the 6th century A.D. or whenever it was the historic King Arthur actually lived. He probably didn't, but still in all, I thought of that concern, and that led me quickly to consideration of one of the great, if I think neglected, novels in the American tradition. Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. This is not a novel that should be given to children, because it is quite a vicious, if artistically presented attack on American capitalist society by, as it were, a distant mirror. The distant mirror being the Camelot that the Connecticut Yankee is sent back to by some unexplained accident of time travel. Now, if King Arthur were trying to decide where to put Camelot, what things would he consider? And is it any way similar to what the world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, is doing right now? Then I went to sleep.
Okay. That sounds like something to dream about.
Exactly.
Jeff Bezos or virgins or whatever. But anyway, and just one more thing. Speaking of cities, I know this actually turned out. Carl, you brought this, and I actually read an article yesterday from the New Left Review of November, December 2017, and there's an article by Mike Davis, who's known as an anthropologist and urban geographer and so forth.
Particularly of your part of the world.
From L.A., works in Southern California, and he wrote an article in this New Left Review, which is often, often too academic for my taste, but he wrote an article called Dateline 1960, in which he, on a monthly basis, talks about various aspects of life, of political life, in the sort of waking up year of 1960 in L.A. and Southern California, and really as someone who grew up there, and I knew the areas he was talking about and some of the people involved and so forth. But I learned an awful lot, given that we don't learn much as children. We grow up in a society characterized by intense class struggle, by vicious class struggle, and we lead our childhood lives in the even now, but even especially then in the 1950s. Especially if you were relatively privileged or just basic middle class, without understanding what the intense class forces are behind everything that's going on, everything that's deciding where people get to live, where freeways get built, where towns get incorporated or not. There was a fascinating article, a fascinating 1 month of each month had a different sort of theme to it. And one of the themes was the origins of the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica in the 1950s. And as that evolved, Daniel Ellsberg had his origins there, and the game theory that was going on. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Really fascinating stuff.
I found it particularly fascinating, and do recommend it highly. And we'll put a link to that too on the
and if
on the Facebook
you
page.
happen to be, if you don't know this, and you happen to be plugged into the university library system, you can read this on their website.
I think we can put it up so that you can read it on our Facebook page,
okay.
too.
Well, that
So
would be
see.
fine, too, yeah.
It struck me particularly, I'm dating myself a bit here, but I probably can't avoid it.
Yeah.
1960 was the year I went to college. And if I think about what I knew and thought of the world, and of course I had a fairly high opinion of what I knew and thought of the world in 1960, if I think about that and compare with what is pointed out in this article to be the case, I am shocked at how different they were, how unaware of the political and economic circumstances of America that was about to elect John Kennedy president.
Yeah.
I was. I mean, it was. It really is quite remarkable, and it's the important thing to see now is not just that I was dumb. The important thing to see now is why I was dumb. I was dumb because it wasn't an accident. I was dumb because it had been arranged that way. I was the product of a mid-century American education, good one, and it had the desired effect. It gave me a completely false view of class and society in America, and foreign policy as well, I might add, insofar as that existed in those days. Awareness of it existed. It was completely false, And it was false as a result of one of the great propaganda enterprises in history, the attempt of the American government to convince Americans about the necessity for carrying on war by other means, and war itself, after the Second World War. Noam Chomsky said years ago, much later than this actually, people don't know what's going on, and they don't know that they don't know. And that certainly captured college-bound Carl's views in 1960. I didn't know about the world, and I didn't know that I didn't know, and it wasn't an accident. But it was the construction of the American mind, the way in which the American ruling class handled the only enemy that it actually fears, that is, the American public.
Well, I was going off to fourth grade in 1960.
I knew you were a child. Yes.
I lived at home while I was going to fourth grade, but and walked half a block to school. But a couple of notes, this article is mostly about race. It's mostly about racial politics, but spatial politics, race and space, and how policies get to decide who lives where and who lives with whom. And Los Angeles, as we all realized with an abrupt start in 1965 at the Watts riots, was obviously an extremely racialized place. But people pretended they didn't know that. We're still able to pretend they didn't know that and understand that in 1960. And the other note, of course, has to do with an incident like the coming of the Los Angeles Dodgers to Los Angeles and the building of Dodger Stadium in a place near downtown LA just north of downtown LA called Chavez Ravine, which I read about as a child in the newspaper, in the LA Times or whatever paper we were getting. There was another paper before that, or during that. When cities used to have more than one newspaper, but in any event, this was of course a thing that had to do more with the Latino community, because a lot of Mexican Americans or Mexicans had to be moved out of Chavez Ravine to build Dodger Stadium there, and I, on the one hand, I knew about this. It was in the newspapers. I was only 10, but of course I couldn't really relate. I mean, to me it seemed like progress to build a brand new beautiful baseball stadium, but that's the way it is. But grown-ups felt the same way, for more crass reasons, perhaps.
The thing to read along with Mike Davis's article is in the current number of Jacobin, which continues to publish, sometimes certainly questionable, but otherwise remarkable articles about politics. The current number, which we'll also put on the Facebook page, has an interview with Barbara and Karen Fields, authors of the book Racecraft, and is one of the most cogent accounts of contemporary historical racism that I know of. And they're particularly sharp, it seems to me, in talking about the situation that exists currently, when there's a great deal of nonsense on every side being said about racism in America. The Field sisters know what's going on, and they will tell you if you read their article.
Mm-hmm. And they also did a long interview on the Jacobin podcast, which is run by
that. I haven't heard.
Yeah, so they did about a 2-hour interview. I don't know if you have the patience for 2 hours, but
perhaps the thing that they printed was a transcript of that, or partially a transcript.
I'm not sure.
Of that?
I'm not either. I'm
Yeah.
not sure. But anyway, this fellow Daniel Denver, who does these interviews on Jacobin, they're pretty straightforward, very serious, but I find them listenable. And the two sisters got on there, and they dealt with a wide range of issues, much like what we have referred to many times in this program about what race is and how it's construed, and where people go wrong in identity politics, in understanding race as something really real, as opposed to sort of socially real. But that's.
And that they deal in historically and informed fashion with what I think is the fundamental misunderstanding that we find in American politics today about race. That misunderstanding grew out of the conclusion by American liberals in the 1970s in response to the reassertion of capitalism, comes to be known as neoliberalism. American liberals said, all right, we have a 40-year tradition going back to the New Deal of trying to ameliorate the damages produced by exploitation, by capitalist exploitation. That's indeed what the New Deal was about, trying to take off some of the edge of the depression produced by American capitalism. And for 40 years, from the New Deal to the 1970s, the U.S. government took it for granted that its primary task was to defend the American public from the rigors of capitalism. That changed in the 1970s. American liberals, under attack from the conscious, calculated plan of neoliberalism, American liberals said, okay, we'll give up opposing the exploitation of capitalism, but we feel bad about it. We need to find something to do that makes us look good, in the way that opposition to capitalist exploitation used to. Somebody said, all right, I know what, let's deal with discrimination. Shift our attention from capitalist exploitation to discrimination in American societies. God knows there's plenty of discrimination in American society. Civil rights movements have been telling us that. Let's deal with that. And we've had 40 years then of a politics that looks for, as it were, discriminated against groups to champion. Liberalism gives up the attack on capitalism and takes up the challenge, increasingly historically, of telling people that there's discrimination in the society. Really? And that seems to me to be what American liberalism is mired in right now. And until it recovers a class politics, until it recovers an understanding that the injuries of American society grow from capitalism, then we're not going to get very far. Certainly, racism should be opposed. Discrimination should be opposed. Actually, all of that is true. But as the Field Sisters explain, that's not going to happen until we take on the class structures that produce it in the first place. You're watching News from Neptune, and we are playing the old songs today, I have to say, but still in all, it seems to be necessary.
The only other thing I don't know whether this is appropriate, whether you had planned to talk about this anyway, but there's certainly been a lot flying around this morning about Syria and Turkey and the Kurds.
Exactly.
And so, I'm not saying I understand it. There seems to be some vastly, radically different accounts of what's being said by Rex Tillerson or what's being done by Trump, insofar far as Trump actually does anything, and what Turkey is doing in vis-a-vis the U.S. So maybe you have some. I'm setting you up here.
No, I think you put your finger on the crucial issue, and you're also right to note, which hasn't been much noted in mainstream media, the disarray within the administration on it. The Pentagon and McMaster, the National Security Advisor, saying, "Oh, we're going to set up a 30,000-member army made up primarily of Kurds to cover the border between Syria and Turkey." The Turks say what? They're not down with that, and for obvious reasons. And the difficulty is compounded when the Secretary of State says, we're not going to do that. That's not right at all. I think what it testifies to is a debate within the administration on how to continue its regular foreign policy program, which of course is to diminish the influence of Russia and also China in the Middle East.
That's the hostility towards Iran. That's the need for overthrowing the government of Syria that all recent administrations have shown. The Trump administration seems to be a bit in disarray on this. The reason being that the Trump administration came into office with an attack on these policies. In office, Trump has followed the policies, but now his advisors seem to be dividing a bit on it right now, and the indicator is the question of the continuance of the Damascus regime, the Assad government in Syria. So yeah, the plot thickens. It's consistent with long-term American policy, but of course long-term American policy is hidden from Americans, and only slowly do we get these indications that there are quite fierce debates going on within the American government on these matters, and it's not all clear which way it will go. The difficulties that the U.S. has got itself into in Syria in making this policy actually effective were pointed out nicely by Pepe Escobar in a column, which I will also put on the Aware website, on the News from Neptune website. Let's say that again right. Yeah. The News from Neptune Facebook page this week.
What makes this so particularly difficult and confusing, and I'm not saying I'm following the inside baseball, so to speak, of this very closely. I mean, I've read the couple of articles that our friend Karen Aaron posted on the website from the World Socialist website, but you've got the Kurds, you've got the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, the yes. Syrian, the Kurdish, what have been called
Syrian Kurdish,
what Jacobin has highlighted as sort of anarchist, feminist forces within sort of relatively independent Kurdish Syria, but that are now allied with U.S. forces, which have been for quite some time in taking back the territory that ISIS had occupied or had taken over. And so Turkey doesn't like the Kurds doing anything independent. It doesn't like the idea that there's an independent Kurdish force on their border that's aside from the Kurds that are in Turkey itself, in Iraq, and so forth. And so this confuses this. I mean, this has to be one of the more complicated, just complicated in and of itself, in terms of determining whose interests are being served, how quote unquote U.S. interests, as they're understood by the ruling class, will be served vis-a-vis Turkey, which is a member of NATO, which is apparently, if these reports are correct, Turkey is veering off in opposition to the U.S. and NATO to a certain extent, in its opposition to the Kurds, and therefore veering towards alliances with Russia, China, Iran,
exactly.
and so forth. I don't know where you go to get a really thorough account of all this, or it's just so ongoing and so murky that it's hard to understand.
I have to say one of the good places to go is the site edited by our friend Jeffrey Sinclair called Counterpunch. Mike Whitney has an article on Counterpunch today that makes exactly your point.
Okay.
Whitney writes, Turkey is more important to the U.S. than Ukraine. Now, part of the problem begins right here. Most Americans have been lied to continuously about what the U.S. did in Ukraine, and so take it for granted when they pick up the New York Times and read about Putin's aggression in Ukraine, that it must be true. It's not. It's a lie. But we have only people who pay attention are going to notice that. Turkey, as David was just suggesting, is more important to the U.S. even than Ukraine. The Obama administration ran a coup in Ukraine, basically, because of its desire to annoy the Russians. It is the essential land bridge. Turkey is the essential land bridge and energy hub that's destined to bind Europe and Asia together into the world's biggest free trade zone. If Turkey breaks out of Washington's orbit and moves into Moscow's camp, Washington's plan to pivot to Asia will collapse in a heap. We remember, of course, that the pivot to Asia was substantially furthered by the Obama-Clinton administration when Clinton was Secretary of State. That's what they were doing. What they were doing was consistent with American policy all along, but Americans don't know that. They're purposely prevented from knowing that by the sort of propaganda we get through mainstream media. So while McMaster, that is the National Security Advisor, General McMaster in the Trump administration, while McMaster might think that forward deterrence means killing people on the front line, forward deterrence will prevent Russia from achieving its objectives, it's clear that the policy is already working in Putin's favor. Every miscue that Washington makes, like the question of supporting the Kurds in northwest Syria, only adds to Putin's credibility and reputation as a reliable partner. Simply put, the Russian president is gradually replacing Washington as the guarantor of regional security in the Middle East. This is a tectonic development and one that U.S. power brokers will definitely regret in the future. Whitney, I think, is being gentle there. They will move heaven and earth to prevent this from happening in Washington. Washington will move heaven and earth to prevent this from happening. You're listening to News from Neptune. We have a couple of minutes left. Where else do you want to go, David?
I was just going to add, in terms of the YPG, the Rojava Syrian Kurds, and who were somewhat idealized and I think justifiably so.
But have a case, yeah.
In Jacobin. I'm wondering where I haven't been watching Jacobin that closely. I don't know how long it's been since they've written or published any views on where the anarchist feminist Kurdish movement is going. So I will be interested to see. But obviously, it's much more complicated than they presented it when the Kurds just seemed to be fighting ISIS, when the Rojava Kurds seemed to be fighting ISIS. Now they're allied with U.S. interests. They take our arms, and of course, it becomes a big mess.
Yes. And it's true that the difficulty of getting an accurate account even of what's going on the ground, as it were, in Syria, is very great, and that all sides, but particularly the U.S., use this to their advantage. The U.S., which announced belligerently this week that intends to stay in Syria and indeed kill people in Syria for some time to come, has no legal right to be in Syria, of course. The Russians do. The Russians are there as a result of an invitation from a legitimate government. You can deplore the things that have happened in the fighting in Syria, the things that the Russians and others have done, but to understand the genesis of the situation is to see that the U.S. has been pivoting to Asia, in part by trying to undermine governments throughout the border of Eurasia, including Ukraine and Syria. And the guilt, the responsibility of the last administration and now this one for the killing in the Middle East is very great. In a just world, they would be judged on that.
So,
last notes?
Well, I don't know what. In a minute or two, I don't know what I want, what can of worms that I want to open up and not.
There are a lot of them around.
3 minutes. Actually, 3 minutes is a long time. Actually, in talking time, you could speak like 100 words per minute. So
that's right.
That's like one of my letters. But anyway, I'm kind of out of things. Have you got anything else?
I have a little to add here.
Yeah. Who is Paul Booth, by the way?
Paul Booth was a contemporary of mine who was one of the major figures in Students for Democratic Society in the early days. Clever, inventive, and after all these years, more accurate than some of his compatriots in giving an account of what the situation is. More well-known compatriots, yes. More well-known compatriots, that's true.
Yeah.
I made a note here to dedicate this particular program to Paul Booth, who died this week, and requiescat in pace. You have been watching News from Neptune for the third week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery. This has been a Shutdown the Military edition, with thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, who never shuts down, thankfully. And inshallah, we will be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.